Donald Trump says there is not enough political will to ban lethal assault guns and that there is only so much he can do. The US president currently en route to Texas, having spent time in Ohio. In both states, a number of protesters are blaming Trump's rhetoric for playing a role in the violence. Pakistan says it's expelling India's ambassador and suspending bilateral trade. A response to New Delhi's decision to revoke the special status for Kashmir and take full control of the disputed region. As it is put under lockdown, hundreds of poor migrant labourers are now trying to leave. And a laser show lights up Hong Kong's harbour, the festive-looking scene part of ongoing protests. Laser lights have become a weapon in the demonstrations, which Beijing says are overall getting more violent. Welcome to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Eve Irvine. It's good to have you with us. There's no political appetite for stricter gun control, and there's only so much I can do, so says US President Donald Trump, adding that he was in favour of greater background checks when it comes to selling lethal weapons. Trump is now en route to El Paso after visiting hospitals and meeting with the loved ones of victims in Dayton, Ohio. A visit greeted by numbers of protesters who blame the president's rhetoric for fueling anger, as Simon Harding reports.
It's a first stop for Donald Trump in Dayton, Ohio, where 9 people were shot dead at the weekend. The president visited the site of the shooting and then went to a hospital where some of the injured were treated. This as protesters lined the streets to voice their anger towards the president with an appearance of the famous baby Trump blimp. Donald Trump has faced criticism for stoking hatred, but before leaving, he condemned all kinds of hate crime.
I am concerned about the rise of any group of hate. I don't like it. Any group of hate. I am, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's any other kind of supremacy, whether it's Antifa, whether it's any group of hate, I am very concerned about it, and I'll do something about it.
After his visit in Dayton, the president heads to the border town of El Paso in Texas, where 22 people were gunned down in a Walmart store. There is much anger aimed at Trump, with many believing that his inflammatory comments about Hispanics led to the shooting, some going as far as holding the president partially responsible.
I don't feel comfortable with the fact that Trump is coming here with all those things he said about Hispanics. I think everything that is going on right now is because of what he said.
Although Donald Trump has criticized white supremacists since the shooting, here in El Paso, there's a feeling that it's no longer safe to be Latino.
Under a complete shutdown and with its autonomy revoked by New Delhi, many poor migrant workers in Kashmir have begun to flee the region. The move by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to change the status of Kashmir has caused much expected outrage on the other side. Pakistan now expelling India's ambassador there and cutting off bilateral trade. The two countries have already fought 2 wars over control of Kashmir. Yana Lee brings us the latest.
Furious at India's decision to downgrade Kashmir's status, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan and his government have decided to retaliate. They'll expel India's High Commissioner and suspend bilateral trade.
Prime Minister Imran Khan directed that all diplomatic channels be activated to expose the brutal Indian racist regime and human rights violations.
Pakistanis aren't alone. Opposition forces in India as well as Indian Kashmiris have been voicing their anger at Prime Minister Narendra Modi's move.
I feel that is not democratic. It has violated all the democratic processes.
You're torturing us in the name of ordinary Indians. You're betraying them as much as us.
Meanwhile, in Indian-administered Kashmir, armed police patrol empty streets. There's been a crippling curfew since midnight Sunday. Despite this, sporadic protests have been taking place. Unrest in Kashmir dates back to partition, when the Hindu ruler of the Muslim-majority region decided to join India. Islamabad and New Delhi have gone to war twice over the disputed land. China, too, has at times claimed part of the region. On the Indian side, a secessionist rebellion and the ensuing crackdown has killed more than 70,000 people in the past 30 years. However, its partial autonomy had been granted in Article 370 of the country's constitution. an article that the Hindu nationalist government in power has revoked. Now, Indian-controlled Kashmir will lose its special status, its flag and its criminal code.
Well, we can speak now to historian and novelist Mr. Vijay Singh to get his view on it all. Mr. Singh, thanks for your time. Firstly, can I ask you simply, how worried does this all make you?
Well, in the sense that, in 1975, I was in India at that time when Mrs. Gandhi, the former Indian Prime Minister, cracked down the emergency on us, and I could see what their atmosphere at that point was, where communications, where habeas corpus, normal freedom, constitutional rights were taken away. And today that's obviously not happened in this part of the land, but in Kashmir it is happening. So I think it is not so much because the Article 370, its revocation, its amendments, I think it has also crossed the minds of all the governments that have been there, particularly in the last 30 years in the country. That includes the opposition at the moment. But it was just that how to go about the whole process, because when you don't have the popular sentiment in that part of the state, in this case J&K, Jammu and Kashmir, with you, then how do you go about it? Now, because this government has a large mandate, and they already put it out in the electoral manifesto that we are going to revoke Article 370 and 35A, which is a part of it, which gives Jammu and Kashmir a certain amount of autonomy and certain other things by which, for example, Jammu and Kashmir state cannot be touched, its demographics cannot be touched. So here, because they had the mandate from the government, they actually dared it. And if today, for example, in north of India, the normal Hindu sentiment is pro-government, pro-Modi, pro what has happened. And the reason for that being that there is a certain amount of enjoyment or let's say rejoicing that you've used the muscle to teach people a lesson. But one must also understand the other side, what you were talking about Pakistan before, that where has this come from? After all, 1947, when Indian part of the Kashmir came here, they were living, and we've all been there on holiday, we were all having a very nice time, but it all started changing. I remember I was at Liberation at that time, when Mujahideen came into Afghanistan, and when Russians came in, and at that point I remember talking to my chef de service, and I told him at that time that you will see one day it will all reach through Pakistan, it will reach Kashmir. So that's the situation that has reached. 26/11 happened in Bombay, where hundreds of people were killed. There have been terrorist attacks, and there is no end to it. And I think there has been a Hindu radicalization favored by all kinds of fundamental thoughts which are going about from Trump this way all over the world. So there is a certain crystallization of a radical sentiment, which is what explains it. But I think what is worrisome is the future tomorrow, because I know from my childhood when America infested Vietnam, could not win, and nobody did it. Russia did it in its colonies, which could not. So here again, we are in a situation where army's been, it was already infested with army, and here we've sent, several hundred troops there. It's a difficult part of the world between three nuclear states, let's say China, India, and Pakistan. Two of them sworn enemies as of the last 70 years. So it's a difficult area, and I think that this rejoicing is not going to be very long-lived. It's going to be short-lived because there will be a reaction to it.
Indeed, we'll have to wait.
They are prepared for it in some ways.
Indeed, we'll have to wait and see, I guess, what develops. And we're already seeing that reaction from Pakistan. But before I let you go, Mr. Singh, can I just ask you, give me an idea of what the reality of the region was like for people living there? Did the autonomy work? We're currently seeing pictures of migrants to that region now trying to get out of it again.
Well, obviously, if I was there, I would also think twice about whether I'm going to work. Now, people are saying, for example, because if Kashmir is going to has become a union territory, which means it is open now to investments from India. Indians can go, Hindus can go, Muslims can go. Tomorrow the demographics of the place can be changed, a bit like the settlements before. But, these are things to be seen. But here I was at the dinner tonight where people were talking between themselves, and rich people talk to themselves, and they were saying that I wouldn't go to Kashmir and invest my capital there. I wouldn't go and buy a house there because, capitalism, first thing it requires is peace. And so, I mean, as you are seeing from poor chaps who are scared of what's going to happen, I think things will sort of calm down in a while. But from the other side also, well, it's a situation of conflict, let's say, and for people who had just gone to work there, not just work there. Today, before speaking to you, I spoke to a filmmaker friend of mine in Lucknow, which is another, heavily Muslim population area, which was called the Constantinople of India. And I asked him, and he went out and met a lot of people in the neighborhood, and a lot of popular people. He says there wasn't any great sentiment there. Because by and large, the normal man who's there, he's there in a poor country like India, is there to earn his livelihood.
Indeed.
And he was talking to Muslims in Lucknow.
Indeed.
Now, similarly, these people who are there for work, I guess they're going there instead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Singh, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks for giving us some insight into that situation there. And of course, as you were saying, we'll just have to wait and see as how that situation develops there in Kashmir. Thanks very much for your time, Mr. Vijay Singh, coming to us there from New Delhi. Well, meanwhile, behind bars for planning a potential terrorist attack and for plotting to travel to Syria, 2 French women have been handed sentences of 7 and 6 years, respectively. It is a first of its kind in France. Our reporter Nadia Messi was at the courthouse for us.
It is a first for France. A woman convicted of being inspired by the Islamic State group to carry out a terror attack, even though there was no evidence that attack was imminent. This was a crime committed entirely online. The woman in question, known only here as Jana C, has been given 7 years behind bars for her actions on the internet. She used the website Telegram to post that she wanted to go to heaven and that she wanted to bring the infidels with her. She talked about using a suicide vest and she Googled explosives. But there was no evidence that she had bought any explosives, nor was there any evidence that she'd decided a location for this attack or who her targets would be. Similarly, in the case of the other woman convicted here today, Julika S., she's been given 6 years in prison for plotting to go to Syria, even though she hadn't bought a ticket to Syria and there was no evidence that her travel was imminent. But the prosecutors in this case were clear. They reminded the judges of the context of these women's arrests. This was a month after the Nice terror attacks in July 2016, when over 80 people here in France had been killed. The French government had just extended the state of emergency, and there was a fear that more attacks could be imminent. And the prosecutors here said that in that context, you didn't need planning to carry out a terror attack, and that an attack by these women could have been imminent. Now, that was something the judges here clearly took very seriously, and that's why Jana S. and Julika C. have been given 7 and 6 years, respectively, in this case.
Nadia Messi reporting for us there. Well, now protests in Hong Kong have been lighting up the skies as more and more demonstrators are arming themselves with lasers, even holding a light show on the harbour in support of one protester who was arrested for possessing laser pens. Beijing says overall the protests are getting more violent. A number of countries have now issued warnings against travelling to the city. Thomas Waterhouse has the story.
A day after Beijing warned them not to play with fire, demonstrators in Hong Kong played with lasers instead. Flecks of light danced brightly on the facade of the city's Space Museum as crowds showed their support for one university student in particular. He was found in possession of 10 laser guns, which have been repeatedly used by protesters to damage police cameras and sabotage surveillance efforts. He was arrested during scuffles on Tuesday.
A large group of protesters surrounded Sham Shui Po police station, asking for the release of a person arrested for possession of offensive weapons. The gathering soon descended to a violent incident.
Since the pro-democracy rallies began, police have detained over 500 demonstrators and charged many of them with rioting. But after days of noisy protests, one corner of the city was more hushed on Wednesday as lawyers staged a silent march against politically motivated prosecutions.
We are here to uphold the rule of law. We call on the Secretary for Justice to account for the discriminatory treatment of what appear to be offenders under the law. They must be given the same treatment. They must be given the protection of the law.
Officials in Beijing, meanwhile, are said to be highly concerned by recent developments and are studying the situation to decide what steps, if any, they will take.
And that's where we're going to have to leave it for this edition. Do take care.